You're running, aren't you? Chasing a life that keeps slipping through your fingers like sand. Grit you can't hold, no matter how tightly you clench your fists. Every day you care so much about being enough, about getting it right, about holding the world together. But what if caring is the cage? What if the freedom you crave, the peace you ache for, begins the moment you stop trying to trap the sand and let it fall? There's an ancient Buddhist secret that flips everything you thought you knew about living. Ready to see it? Picture a man, his back bent under the weight of a heavy sack, trudging through a dusty village at dawn. The sack is coarse, woven from rough hemp, and it bulges with salt, grains that shimmer faintly in the early light, each one a tiny promise of value, of purpose. This is no ordinary burden. It's his life's work, his identity, his everything. Every day, he hoists it onto his shoulders, feeling the coarse fibers dig into his skin, the weight pressing against his spine. He believes this sack is what keeps him safe, what makes him matter. Without it, who would he be? This is the story of the man who carried the sack of salt, a parable whispered through the ages in the quiet teachings of Buddhism. He lived in a village nestled by a wide, restless river, its waters glinting like a mirror under the sun. Each morning, he set out to cross that river, the sack slung across his back, his steps careful but strained. The villagers watched him, some with pity, others with curiosity, but none dared ask why he clung so fiercely to his load. To him, the salt was precious, proof of his effort, his worth, his control over a world that felt chaotic and fleeting. But the river was not kind. Its currents swirled, tugging at his legs, whispering of change, of impermanence. Each time he waded through, water seeped into the sack, dissolving the salt grain by grain. By the time he reached the other side, the sack was lighter, not because he'd succeeded, but because he'd lost what he was so desperate to keep. He'd stand there, dripping and weary, staring at the diminished load, his heart heavy with frustration. "Why can't I hold on to it all?" He'd mutter. "Why does it always slip away?" This man is you. He's me. He's every one of us who carries a sack of salt, our own invisible burdens, woven from the things we think we must hold on to feel whole. For some, it's the weight of perfection, the need to get every decision right, to never falter. For others, it's the fear of loss, of a job, a loved one, a dream. Or maybe it's the ache of comparison, the belief that our worth lies in measuring up to others. We carry these burdens because we've been taught they define us, that letting go would mean losing ourselves. The man with the sack of salt stood trembling on the riverbank, his eyes fixed on the sodden hemp slung across his back. The sack, once brimming with crystalline grains, now sagged, its weight diminished but somehow heavier in his heart. Each day was the same. He'd wade through the swirling currents, feeling the river's cold fingers tug at his burden, dissolving his precious salt. And each day, he'd emerge on the other side, not triumphant but defeated, his shoulders aching, his spirit bruised by the loss he couldn't prevent. He'd kneel by the water's edge, scooping the damp remnants in his calloused hands, whispering to himself, "If only I could carry it all. If only I could make it stay." One morning, as the sun painted the river gold, a quiet figure approached, a monk, his robes fluttering like leaves in the breeze. The man barely noticed, consumed by his ritual of checking the sack, counting what was left. The monk sat on a smooth stone nearby, watching with eyes that seemed to hold the river itself, deep, patient, unjudging. Finally, the man spoke, his voice raw with frustration. "Why does the river take my salt? I work so hard to carry it, to keep it safe. What am I doing wrong?" The monk tilted his head, his gaze soft but piercing. "Look behind you," he said. "Look at the path you've walked." The man turned, his brow furrowed. For the first time he saw it, along the trail where he'd trudged each day, where the river's water had spilled from his sack. A ribbon of wildflowers bloomed, vivid purples and yellows, swaying gently in the dawn. On the other side of the path, where he'd carried a second, unblemished sack that lost no salt, the earth lay barren, cracked and still. He blinked, his breath catching. "But the flowers are beautiful," he stammered, "yet I've lost so much. The salt was mine to keep. I've failed." The monk's voice came like a whisper of wind over water. "Have you failed, or have you been carrying the wrong treasure? You grieve the salt you've lost, but you've not seen the life you've created." The man shook his head, his hands tightening around the sack. "The salt is my purpose," he insisted. "It's what makes me who I am. Without it, I'm nothing." This is where we find ourselves, isn't it? Like the man with the sack of salt, we cling to our own burdens, our plans, our expectations, our need to be seen as enough. We carry them through the rivers of our lives, believing they define us, only to watch them dissolve in the face of change, time, or loss. We feel the sting of dukkha, the suffering the Buddha spoke of, not because life is cruel, but because we've built our worth on what cannot last. This is the injustice we inflict upon ourselves, the mistaken belief that our value lies in what we can hold, control, or achieve. The man with the sack of salt stood frozen, his knuckles white around the coarse hemp, the river's murmur filling the silence between him and the monk. The wildflowers along the path glowed in the morning light, their delicate petals a quiet rebuke to his years of struggle. The monk's words hung heavy in the air. The river doesn't ask you to carry the salt. It asks you to walk with it. For so long, he'd seen the river as his adversary, stealing his purpose, his worth. But now, as the water lapped gently at his feet, something stirred within him. A flicker of understanding, fragile yet undeniable, like a single ember in the dark. He looked down at the sack, its damp weight a familiar ache across his shoulders. How many years had he carried it, believing it was his duty, his identity? How many nights had he lain awake, tallying the grains he'd lost, cursing the river's relentless flow? The monk rose from the stone, his movements slow, deliberate, and pointed to the water. "Set it down," he said, his voice soft but steady, like the current itself. "Let the river take what was never yours to keep." The man's breath caught, his heart pounding against the walls of his chest. To let go was to risk everything, to face the emptiness he'd feared all along. And yet, the flowers whispered another possibility, that in releasing the salt, he might find something greater. With trembling hands, he loosened his grip. The sack slipped from his shoulder, thudding softly onto the riverbank. For a moment, he stood rigid, waiting for the world to collapse, for his worth to dissolve like the salt he'd mourned. But nothing broke. The river kept flowing, the flowers kept swaying, and the sky stretched wide above, indifferent yet kind. He took a step toward the water, then another, until his toes sank into the cool, silted bed. The current swirled around his ankles, not pulling, not pushing, but simply being. For the first time, he felt it, not as a thief, but as a partner, a guide. He closed his eyes, and his breath fell into rhythm with the river's song. In that moment, he was no longer the man with the sack of salt. He was simply a man, alive, present, whole. This is the awakening the Buddha spoke of, not a thunderclap, but a quiet unraveling of the illusions we've woven. The man's suffering, his dukkha, had come from clinging to a false treasure, from believing his worth lay in what he could hold. But in setting the sack down, he saw the truth of anicca, that all things pass, not to diminish us, but to free us. He glimpsed anatta, the absence of a fixed self, realizing he was not the salt, nor the sack, nor even the man he'd thought he must be. He was the walking, the breathing, the seeing, the fleeting, beautiful moment unfolding before him. This is our awakening too. Like the man, we stand at the riverbank of our lives, clutching our own sacks of salt. Our fears, our regrets, our need to be perfect. We've been taught, especially in America, that to care is to control, to strive, to never let go. We carry the weight of who we think we should be. The successful professional, the flawless parent, the person who has it all together. But what if, like the man, we've been carrying the wrong treasure? What if the river, life's ceaseless change, is not our enemy, but our teacher, showing us that peace lies not in holding on, but in opening our hands? The man with the sack of salt walked away from the river, his steps lighter, not because the world had changed, but because he had. The wildflowers still bloomed along the path, their colors a quiet him to the life he'd unknowingly nurtured. He no longer counted the grains he'd lost. He counted the moments he was living. Each breath, each glance at the sky, each heartbeat aligning with the river's endless flow. The Buddha's wisdom had shown him, life isn't a burden to carry, but a rhythm to join. To stop caring about what must fade is to start living in what is true. This is the heart of the parable, the gentle truth it offers us. The river of life asks not for our control, but for our presence. In America, we're taught to grip tightly, to our plans, our fears, our need to be enough. But Buddhism whispers of anicca, that all things pass, of anatta, that we are not our burdens, of dukkha, that suffering fades when we let go. The man's awakening is ours too, to release the sack of salt, our regrets, our need for perfection, and to walk with compassion for ourselves and others. Peace isn't found by forcing life to bend, it's found by softening into its current, by trusting that every step, even the faltering ones, sows flowers we may not yet see. Today, take a moment. Feel the weight you carry. Ask yourself, what is my sack of salt? What could I set down, not out of defeat, but out of courage? You don't need to have all the answers. You only need to take one step, one breath, and let the river guide you. This is the path to peace, to a life not of striving but of being. What did this story stir in you? Have you ever had a moment when you let go and found peace, a fleeting glimpse of clarity that changed how you saw yourself? Share it below. We'd love to hear your story. Or tell us, what Buddhist parable would you like us to explore next? If this resonated, pass it on to someone who might need to hear it, and join us for more journeys into wisdom that awakens the heart.